Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to the last of the undisputed letters of Paul that we're going to look at. In this case, we're going to examine the letter to the Romans. So look a little bit here with the date and the audience for the letter to the Romans. The letter to the Romans was written around the years of 57 to 58 CE/AD. The extended portion of the letter, chapter 16, which is a totally different letter in of itself, was probably written about the same time, maybe a year later. So the first 15 chapters forms one solid letter. Chapter 16 is a totally separate letter, but it was probably written around the same time, maybe a year later at most. The audience for the letter to the Romans is the Christian community in Rome who were already present in the city. This would be both Jewish and Gentile Christian. The main purpose behind the letter was to explain Paul's theology to the Roman Church. The Roman Church was probably aware somewhat of his theology, or at least him, likely though in a negative manner, possibly from Peter, due to the Antioch incident. Paul does not mention Peter by name. He does mention how somebody already has laid the foundation for the Roman Church. And based on all the evidence that we have, that is more than likely Peter. We don't have any evidence of anybody else other than Peter and Paul being the founders of the Roman Church. Peter may not have been there at this time either. That's also a possibility why he wasn't mentioned. But I'd say the chances are very good that he is writing to explain his theology, that probably from the incident that took place in Antioch that's described in the letter to the Galatians. Peter probably had some negative things to say about Paul. And so Paul is writing to the Roman church because he just wants them to be aware of his theology. So, kind of starting off here, let's look at the gospel according to Paul, which is the heart of the letter. The first point is that no one can fulfill the law or the Torah. Paul gives out this long, long written example of how no one can fulfill the law. It's impossible to fulfill the law or the Torah. Very similar to what he wrote in the letter to the Galatians, just much more detail. But he mentions how the death of Christ frees us from the law, the Torah. Again, his view, starting from Galatians, how the death of Christ does away with the Torah of the law. And in baptism, the sacrament of baptism, the ritual of baptism, well, I shouldn't completely use the term ritual here because Christians universally recognize baptism as a sacrament pretty much. But in baptism, we die with Christ and we then share in his resurrection. And in dying with Christ, we are free from the Torah, from the law. So, to rehash quickly here, the basic gospel according to Paul: no one can fulfill the Torah, the Jewish law. It's just not possible. However, the death of Christ does away with the Torah. And in baptism, we die with Christ. And so, because we die with Christ and we share in his resurrection, the dying with Christ frees us from the Torah, from the law. So that's really the basic heart of the letter to the Romans, Paul explaining his theology in, obviously, if you look at the passages that I've cited, a lot of text. But look a little bit at some other elements regarding the letter to the Romans. Look at here original sin. The term original sin, it was coined by St. Augustine of Hippo in his works against Pelagius. In defending his teaching on original sin, Augustine relied heavily on Paul's letter to the Romans, particularly those passages there. So, give a little bit of background here, a little bit of feedback. Augustine of Hippo, he was one of the early church fathers and Bishop of Hippo, and he's writing against a British monk named Pelagius. Pelagius essentially argued that it was possible, though not likely, for someone to live a life free of sin, that by the use of their own free will, they could possibly live a life free of sin. And the only time they would really need to turn to Christ would be if they committed a sin. Augustine responds back with that by saying no. And essentially, this led into the building block of the teaching that's known as original sin, which is a traditional Christian teaching. Although I would say that in maybe the latter part of the 20th century, Christians started more strongly challenging the teaching of original sin. But in any case, this is the basic teaching laid out by Augustine. Due to the disobedience, the sin of Adam, we have inherited a sinful nature. That simply put, it's nearly impossible for us not to sin. Now, according also to this theology or traditional, one of the traditional understandings of baptism is that baptism removes all sin, although that idea was challenged by Calvin and Zwingli, but traditionally speaking, that it removes all sin, including original sin, but the temptation to sin will still be there. But in any case, Augustine holds that due to the disobedience, the sin, you could say, of Adam and Eve, humans have inherited a sinful nature. And he based this idea heavily on Paul's letter to the Romans, particularly the passages that I cited. But is the concept of original sin also challenged in Paul's letter to the Romans? And in this particular passage, Paul, he's referring to Jacob and Esau. And he states how Jacob and Esau, the children of Isaac, did not know sin when they were in the womb. So, does that challenge original sin? Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. The earlier passage from Romans is trying to argue, or at least original sin here in Augustine's case, a sinful nature. Whereas Paul is referring to, in the second passage from Romans, actions. Essentially, I mean, the word sin in Hebrew, it literally means missing the mark, but generally we use it to refer to personal moral failing. And that Jacob and Esau did not know that while they were in the womb. But if they didn't know sin in the womb, did they have a sinful nature? That's where, depending on how you want to look at it, you can say both a yes and a no. But one last thing to look at here with Paul in the letter to the Romans, Paul and homosexuality. Among the actions that Paul condemns in his letter to the Romans is homosexuality, and this condemnation is also found in 1 Corinthians. Where Paul essentially states that those that engage in homosexual behavior will be among those that will not see the kingdom of God. They will not receive the kingdom of God. Now, Paul's condemnation of homosexuality was based on a traditional understanding of the Torah, the law. Particularly, I'm looking at the passage from Leviticus. The traditional understanding of homosexuality was that people chose homosexuality, that they could choose heterosexuality if they wanted to, but instead they decided to choose this lifestyle. However, this traditional condemnation of homosexuality has been challenged since 1975, when the APA, that's the American Psychological Association, removed homosexuality from its list of behavioral disorders. So essentially, what the APA, the American Psychological Association, declared, it removed homosexuality from its list of behavioral disorders, where it stated that, someone who is heterosexual cannot become homosexual, and someone who is homosexual cannot become heterosexual. This is just how they are. And that challenges the traditional understanding of homosexuality, which is that it was based on a choice. And we do have to factor in, the Bible, it is a collection of books, hence its name in Greek, Biblios, and of the books that are composed within it, none of them form a modern scientific text, because modern science has its origins within the 16th century CE/AD, whereas many historians would place the last book of the Bible, in this case would be, if we're looking at Jewish and Christian scriptures, the last book within the Christian canonical New Testament would be about mid-second century. So there you go. But question here, based on the APA's ruling, would Paul change his attitude regarding homosexuality? Well, to a certain degree, we can only speculate that answer because Paul's not here to actually respond. He's deceased. So we can only guess. Among your liberal Christians, certainly your mainline liberal Protestants, um, they would be more inclined to say yes, or if Paul was to maintain the traditional view that it's a sin, many would say he's just in the wrong. Now, among your more conservative Christians, they would be ones to state that no, Paul would not change his attitude. I mean, certainly they wouldn't be, across the board, but of course, with, conservative, the word referring to conserve or maintain, that they would be ones, arguing more for the traditional understanding that homosexuality is a sin. But would Paul change his attitude? You can only speculate. But I will state that there's arguably a lot of things that Paul would have changed his attitude on. And that's in part because, he was essentially an apocalyptic Jew. He didn't consider that people would be reading his works 2,000 years later because he didn't think there would be anybody here, to read them. So I'm sure that there are a lot of things he would have written differently. Well, that's essentially all that we have with the letter to the Romans. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Until then, take care.